"You're finished, Ethan. Nobody will ever hire you again." The words echoed through the glass-walled conference room long after the meeting ended. Some people looked down at their laptops. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few didn't even try to hide their smirks. But Ethan Walker simply stood there, holding a worn leather folder against his chest, his expression calm in a way that made no sense. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a gray autumn sky. The city moved as if nothing had happened. Taxis crawled through traffic. Elevated trains rattled past steel towers. Life continued. Yet inside that room, something had just been taken from him. Or at least that was what everyone believed. Victoria Sterling remained standing at the head of the polished oak table. At 38, she was one of the youngest CEOs in the logistics industry. Sharp, brilliant, ruthless. Investors admired her. Competitors feared her. Employees obeyed her. She adjusted the sleeve of her tailored navy blazer and looked directly at Ethan. "You should have listened." Her voice was calm, controlled, final. Ethan nodded once. Maybe. The answer seemed to irritate her more than an argument would have. Around the table, executives shifted in their seats. They had expected anger, defensiveness, desperation. Instead, the man they had just fired looked almost peaceful. Ethan gathered the last document from the table and slipped it into his folder. He wasn't dressed like an executive anymore. Not really. His suit was older than most of the people in the room. The cuffs were slightly worn. The shoes had been polished so many times the leather had begun to soften around the edges. But he carried himself with a quiet dignity that expensive clothes could never buy. As he turned toward the door, Victoria spoke one final time. "This industry is changing. Men like you don't survive changes." The room fell silent. Ethan paused. For a moment, everyone waited. Then he smiled faintly. Not a smile of victory. Not a smile of surrender. Just a tired smile from a man who had weathered storms before. "Maybe," he said again. Then he walked away. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Numbers descended one floor at a time. 32, 31, 30. Ethan stared at his reflection in the mirrored wall. Gray touched the edges of his dark hair now. Fine lines framed his eyes. Life had a way of writing its stories on a person's face. His phone vibrated. A text message appeared. It was from Sophie. "Dad, are we still getting pizza tonight?" Ethan looked at the screen for several seconds before typing back. "Absolutely. Extra pepperoni." A small smiley face appeared almost instantly. His chest tightened. Not from fear. From love. Sophie was 10 years old and somehow still believed her father could fix anything. Broken bicycles. Leaky faucets. Bad days. She had no idea that 30 minutes earlier he had lost the job that paid their rent. The elevator doors opened into the lobby. Employees crossed the marble floor carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Nobody noticed him. Nobody stopped him. To them, he was already becoming part of the past. Outside, a cold wind swept between the skyscrapers. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter and stepped onto the crowded sidewalk. Cars rushed past. Horns echoed through the canyon of steel and glass. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. The city sounded enormous. Indifferent. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded photograph he always carried. Sophie grinned back at him from a summer carnival 2 years earlier, cotton candy covering half her face. Ethan stared at the picture for a moment. Then he slipped it back into his pocket. Across town, inside her corner office high above the skyline, Victoria Sterling watched his figure disappear into the crowd below. "He'll never recover from this," one executive said quietly behind her. Victoria didn't answer. She simply turned away from the window and returned to her work. Neither of them knew that somewhere beyond the city limits, hidden beneath rust, weeds, and years of neglect, something everyone else had abandoned was waiting. And before long, the decision made inside that conference room would become the moment neither of them would ever forget. The small apartment felt warmer than it really was. The old radiator clicked and rattled against the November cold while the scent of pepperoni pizza drifted through the kitchen. Sophie sat cross-legged on the couch, finishing a science worksheet with complete concentration. Every few minutes, she glanced toward her father and smiled. Ethan smiled back every time. He had become good at that. Good at hiding storms. Good at carrying weight without letting it reach the people he loved. The television played softly in the background, filling the room with harmless noise. For a little while, everything felt normal. Almost. Then Sophie's pencil stopped moving. "Dad," she asked. "Yes, sweetheart." "Did something bad happen today?" Ethan froze for half a second. Not long enough for most people to notice. Long enough for a daughter who knew him better than anyone. "Why would you ask that?" Sophie shrugged. "You smile when you are happy. But today you smile like you were trying to make me happy." The words landed gently, yet they struck deeper than any insult ever could. Ethan looked down at the pizza box sitting open on the coffee table. Children had a way of seeing truth adults spent years learning to hide. Outside, wind pressed softly against the windows. Traffic hummed below. Somewhere down the block, a train horn echoed through the dark. "Things are a little complicated right now," he admitted. Sophie set down her pencil. "Are we in trouble?" Ethan moved beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "No. We are together. That means we are not in trouble." She studied his face carefully. Then she nodded. Somehow she always believed him. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Ethan sat alone at the small kitchen table with a notebook, a calculator, and a stack of bills. The numbers did not lie. Rent, utilities, insurance, groceries, school expenses. The savings account that once felt secure suddenly looked fragile. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the ceiling. For the first time all day, silence settled over him completely. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The kind that arrives when there is nobody left to reassure. The city outside continued moving beneath a blanket of lights. Millions of people. Millions of stories. Yet Ethan felt strangely alone. His phone buzzed. A message from a former coworker appeared. "Sorry about today. Nobody saw it coming." Another followed. "Victoria already hired your replacement." Ethan stared at the screen. Then he locked the phone and set it aside. There was no anger in him. Not yet. Mostly exhaustion. The next morning arrived beneath low clouds and steady cold rain. Ethan spent hours submitting applications. Logistics firms, warehousing companies, transportation groups, consulting positions. Every opening remotely connected to his experience received a carefully written application. By noon, he had sent more than 20. By evening, 3 rejections had already arrived. One company informed him the position had been eliminated. Another had chosen a candidate with more recent experience. The third never even scheduled an interview. Days passed. Then another week. The routine became familiar. Coffee, applications, calls, silence. Sophie never complained. She simply hugged him each morning before school and asked if anything exciting had happened. Ethan always found something hopeful to say. One gray afternoon, after another unsuccessful interview, he took a different route home. Rainwater glistened on cracked pavement. Industrial buildings stretched along the edge of the city like forgotten monuments from another era. Most people drove through without noticing them. Ethan almost did too. Then something caught his eye. Beyond a chain-link fence stood an enormous abandoned property. Rust covered the structures. Broken signs leaned at odd angles. Weeds pushed through concrete. Everything about it looked unwanted. Forgotten. Finished. Ethan slowed his car. The rain tapped softly against the windshield as he stared through the fence. Hundreds of people had probably passed this place and seen nothing but decay. Yet something about it refused to let go of his attention. For reasons he could not explain, he pulled over to the side of the road and kept looking. The rain continued falling as Ethan sat behind the wheel, staring through the chain-link fence. Water streamed down the windshield in slow waves, blurring the outlines of rusted warehouses and silent loading docks. Most people would have seen a graveyard of bad investments. A place where businesses came to die. Ethan saw something else. He could not explain it at first. It was only a feeling. A quiet pull. The same instinct that had helped him solve problems throughout his career while other executives chased trends and headlines. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the fence. Cold wind tugged at his jacket. Puddles splashed beneath his shoes. The property stretched farther than he first realized. Several massive warehouse buildings sat empty beneath the gray sky. Old rail access lines cut through the land. Cracked pavement spread across dozens of acres. Despite years of neglect, the location itself seemed strangely valuable. Ethan studied every detail. The highway sat less than a mile away. Freight routes intersected nearby. Distribution corridors connected the area to multiple states. He frowned. Why would something positioned so strategically be abandoned? The question followed him home. That evening, While Sophie worked on a school project at the kitchen table, Ethan opened his laptop and began researching. Property records, tax filings, city planning documents, public transportation maps. Hour after hour, he dug deeper. The deeper he went, the more confused he became. The property had once belonged to a manufacturing company that collapsed nearly a decade earlier. Lawsuits followed. Ownership disputes delayed redevelopment. Investors lost interest. The city labeled it a failed industrial zone. Analysts described it as a financial black hole. Yet something did not fit. Ethan enlarged several planning maps on his screen. His eyes narrowed. Then he leaned closer. New highway expansion proposals. Rail modernization discussions. Infrastructure studies buried inside public reports few people ever read. The pieces were scattered. Incomplete. Easy to miss. But together they painted a different picture. Sophie looked up from her project. Dad, Ethan blinked. Yeah. You have that look again. He smiled. What look? The one you get when you are trying to solve something nobody else understands. Ethan laughed softly. Do I really do that? All the time. She returned to coloring her presentation board while Ethan stared back at the screen. Maybe she was right. Over the next several days, the abandoned property became impossible to ignore. He drove past it repeatedly, sometimes in the morning, sometimes after sunset. Each visit raised more questions. Each question pulled him deeper. Meanwhile, reality continued pressing against him. Rejection emails arrived almost daily. Savings continued shrinking. Bills continued arriving. The pressure grew heavier with every passing week. One afternoon, Ethan met an old colleague named Greg Mercer for coffee. Greg had worked with him for years before retiring from the logistics industry. If anyone understood industrial properties, it was Greg. Ethan showed him the address. Greg nearly laughed. That place. Ethan nodded. What about it? Greg shook his head immediately. Forget it. Why? Because it is worthless. Ethan remained silent. Greg leaned back in his chair. Listen, investors looked at that property for years. Nobody wanted it. The cleanup costs alone would scare away most buyers. But the location. Location does not matter if the economics are broken. Ethan stirred his coffee thoughtfully. Greg continued. You lost your job, Ethan. You need stability, not impossible dreams. Stability. The word lingered in Ethan's mind long after the conversation ended. That night he sat alone by the apartment window while Sophie slept down the hall. Snowflakes drifted through the city lights outside. Quiet. Slow. Almost peaceful. He held a notebook filled with numbers. Purchase estimates. Tax obligations. Financing possibilities. Every calculation seemed dangerous. Every scenario carried risk. Yet the more he studied the property, the more convinced he became that everyone was looking backward while something important was quietly moving forward. Somewhere across the city, inside her penthouse office overlooking the skyline, Victoria Sterling reviewed quarterly reports with complete confidence. Growth projections remained strong. Investors remained satisfied. The future seemed predictable, ordered, secure. Neither she nor anyone else knew that a man she considered finished was sitting in a small apartment studying an abandoned piece of land that everyone had already dismissed. And for the first time since losing his job, Ethan Walker felt something he had not felt in weeks. Not certainty, not safety, something far more dangerous. Hope. Hope can be a beautiful thing. It can also be terrifying. Ethan learned that over the following week. Every logical voice around him said the same thing. Walk away. Protect what little you have left. Find another job. Start over. Be practical. Yet every time he drove past the abandoned property, he felt the same quiet conviction growing stronger. One cold Saturday morning, he finally scheduled a meeting with the broker handling the distress sale. The woman arrived carrying a thick folder beneath her arm and an expression that suggested she had repeated the same conversation many times before. They stood near the rusted entrance gate while wind rattled loose metal somewhere inside the property. I should tell you up front, she said. Most people leave after seeing the numbers. Ethan nodded. Show me anyway. For nearly 2 hours they walked the grounds. Empty warehouses stretched across the landscape like sleeping giants. Broken loading bays faced cracked pavement. Faded company logos still clung to walls that had not seen activity in years. The place felt forgotten. Yet Ethan noticed details others overlooked. Access points, rail connections, utility corridors, storage capacity. Every step raised more questions. Every answer deepened his interest. Eventually, they stopped beside an aging warehouse nearly the size of 3 football fields. The broker opened her folder. You understand this is considered a high-risk acquisition. I do. There are environmental concerns. I know. Redevelopment costs could be substantial. Ethan looked across the property. What if it does not need redevelopment? The broker frowned. What do you mean? Ethan remained quiet for a moment. He was not ready to explain. Not because he had all the answers. Because he barely understood the vision himself. He only knew he could see possibilities where others saw failure. That evening, he reviewed the numbers again. Then again. Then again. The purchase would consume nearly everything he had. Savings. Emergency funds. Investments intended for Sophie's future. The realization sat heavily on his shoulders. Across the apartment, Sophie was building a model bridge for school using craft sticks and glue. Can I ask you something? She said. Ethan looked up from the spreadsheets. Always. Have you ever been really scared? The question caught him off guard. Of course. What did you do? Sophie asked. Ethan studied her small bridge taking shape across the table. Usually I kept going anyway. She smiled. That sounds hard. Sometimes it is. Sophie placed another stick onto the bridge. But if you stop, then you never find out what happens. Ethan stared at her. Children often stumbled into wisdom adults spent decades searching for. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, Ethan opened an old wooden box stored in his closet. Inside were photographs, savings records, and memories from another life. A picture of his late wife rested near the top. Her smile seemed frozen in time, warm and reassuring. He sat quietly holding the photograph. I wish you were here, he whispered. Outside, snow drifted past the apartment window. The city glowed beneath a blanket of winter light. Ethan looked down at the numbers one final time. Then he made a decision. Monday morning arrived with sharp winds and gray skies. He visited his bank first. The loan officer reviewed the proposal and quickly shook his head. This property? Ethan nodded. I believe it has potential. The officer sighed. Potential does not appear on balance sheets. A second lender rejected him. Then a third. Everywhere he went, the answer remained the same. Too risky. Too uncertain. Too expensive. By the end of the week, frustration pressed heavily against him. Yet he refused to quit. Finally, after exhausting nearly every traditional option available, Ethan sat alone inside his car overlooking the abandoned property once again. The sun was setting behind the warehouses. Golden light spilled across rusted roofs and broken concrete. The entire place glowed briefly as if reminding him that even forgotten things could still catch the light. His phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name of a financial institution he had nearly given up on. Ethan answered. Mr. Walker? A voice asked. Yes. We reviewed your application again. There may be a way forward. Ethan straightened in his seat. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, he sat motionless staring through the windshield. The opportunity was far from secure. The conditions were difficult. The risk remained enormous. But for the first time, ownership no longer seemed impossible. Across town, Victoria Sterling stood before a room full of investors presenting another successful quarterly forecast. Applause filled the conference center. Confidence filled the room. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Yet neither she nor anyone else knew that a man they had dismissed was preparing to place the largest bet of his life on a piece of land everyone else had already written off as worthless. The closing took place on a freezing Thursday morning beneath a sky the color of steel. There were no reporters, no investors, no celebration, just a conference room inside a small law office and a stack of documents thick enough to make most people nervous. Ethan signed every page slowly. Each signature felt heavier than the last. Savings accumulated over years disappeared with the stroke of a pen. Emergency funds vanished. Future security faded into uncertainty. By the time the final document was signed, almost everything he owned was tied to a property that most experts considered a mistake. The attorney slid the last page across the table. Congratulations, he said politely. You are officially the owner. Ethan nodded quietly. The words sounded surreal. Owner. Not employee. Not manager. Not executive. Owner. When he stepped outside, icy wind swept across the parking lot. For a moment, he simply stood there. His breath drifted into the cold air while traffic moved steadily beyond the intersection. The world looked exactly the same, yet everything had changed. That evening he took Sophie to the property for the first time. The sun was setting behind the warehouses, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Sophie climbed out of the car and stared at the enormous structures. "This is it?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "This is it." She looked around again. Rusted fencing, empty loading docks, broken signs, silence. "It looks kind of sad." Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe." "Why did you buy it?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the largest warehouse. "Because sometimes people stop looking before they see the whole picture." Sophie thought about that. Then she nodded as if it made perfect sense. Children often accepted possibilities adults rejected. Over the following weeks, life became a test of endurance. Ethan could no longer afford to wait for opportunities. He had to create them. Every morning before sunrise, he drove to the property carrying a thermos of coffee and a notebook filled with plans. Every day revealed new problems: damaged roofing, electrical issues, structural repairs, maintenance costs, bureaucratic delays. Every solution required money he did not have. Yet he kept showing up. Snow covered the property during the first month. Then came freezing rain. Then bitter winds that rattled metal siding throughout the night. Ethan spent hours walking the grounds, documenting repairs, and studying every building. His hands grew rough from labor. His shoulders ached constantly. Most evenings he returned home exhausted. Still, he never complained. Sophie noticed anyway. One night, she found him asleep at the kitchen table with paperwork spread across every surface. The lamp cast a warm glow across unfinished reports and financial projections. Carefully, she draped a blanket over his shoulders before returning to bed. Ethan discovered it hours later. The simple gesture stayed with him all day. Meanwhile, the bills continued arriving. Property taxes, insurance premiums, utility assessments, unexpected maintenance expenses. The numbers never seemed to stop. More than once Ethan sat alone wondering if everyone else had been right. Maybe Greg was right. Maybe the banks were right. Maybe Victoria was right. The thought haunted him during quiet moments. Yet every time doubt threatened to take hold, he returned to the same collection of maps and planning reports. The same infrastructure studies. The same future possibilities hidden between technical language and overlooked documents. Something important remained buried there. He could feel it. One afternoon, while cleaning an office inside the main warehouse, Ethan uncovered several old filing cabinets left behind by previous owners. Most contained worthless records, outdated invoices, employee schedules, maintenance logs. But one cabinet held regional transportation reports dating back years. Ethan carried the dusty boxes home and spent nights reviewing them after Sophie fell asleep. Patterns began emerging. Small details, tiny changes, pieces that seemed unrelated at first. He filled notebook after notebook with observations. Across the city, Victoria Sterling continued expanding her logistics empire. New contracts arrived. New partnerships formed. Industry conferences praised her leadership. Financial publications celebrated her success. From the outside, her future appeared unstoppable. Yet inside several boardrooms, conversations had quietly begun shifting. Transportation networks were evolving. Distribution demands were changing. Infrastructure discussions once ignored were attracting new attention. Most executives barely noticed. Ethan did. One cold evening, nearly 3 months after purchasing the property, he stood alone inside the largest warehouse. The building stretched endlessly into shadows. Wind whistled softly through distant beams. Dust floated beneath scattered rays of fading sunlight. The space was silent, almost sacred. Ethan looked across thousands of square feet of emptiness and imagined something different. Trucks moving, lights glowing, activity returning, purpose returning, life returning. The vision remained incomplete, fragile, uncertain, but for the first time since signing those papers, he could almost see the future taking shape. Not clearly enough to understand it, not clearly enough to explain it, just enough to keep going. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, but the property still looked forgotten by the rest of the world. Patches of snow lingered in the shadows of the warehouses while cold rain turned sections of the cracked pavement into shallow pools that reflected the gray sky above. Yet something inside Ethan had changed. The uncertainty remained. The financial pressure remained. The exhaustion certainly remained. But beneath all of it, a quiet sense of direction had begun to take root. Every morning he arrived before sunrise. Every evening he left after dark. The property had become more than an investment. It had become a promise. A promise to Sophie. A promise to himself. A promise that losing everything would not be the final chapter of his story. One Tuesday afternoon, Ethan sat inside a temporary office he had assembled from salvaged furniture and an old folding table. The heater rattled in the corner, while stacks of reports covered nearly every surface. He was reviewing transportation forecasts when a particular document caught his attention again. He had read it dozens of times already, yet something about one paragraph refused to leave him alone. He leaned closer, then closer still. A map rested beside the report. His eyes moved between them repeatedly. One route, then another. Rail access, highway expansion, freight volume projections, regional distribution demand. Suddenly, several disconnected pieces seemed to align. Not perfectly, not enough to prove anything, but enough to make his pulse quicken. Ethan pushed back from the desk and stared through the dusty office window toward the distant rail line beyond the property. For months, he had been asking the same question. What are people missing? For the first time, he felt as though he was getting closer to the answer. That evening, he drove home unusually quiet. Sophie noticed immediately. She always did. During dinner, she set down her fork and tilted her head. You found something. Ethan smiled. What makes you think that? Because you forgot to complain about my broccoli. He laughed softly. Maybe I am distracted. That means you found something. Ethan shook his head. Maybe I found a question. Sophie grinned. You like questions? Sometimes. No, she said confidently. You love questions. Her certainty made him smile long after dinner ended. Later that night, while Sophie slept, Ethan remained awake at the kitchen table, surrounded by maps and notes. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The city lights shimmered through the darkness. Hour after hour, he worked through scenarios. If certain infrastructure projects moved forward, transportation patterns would shift. If transportation patterns shifted, distribution networks would need to adapt. If distribution networks adapted, locations once considered secondary could become critically important. It was still speculation, still risk, still a possibility rather than a certainty. But the logic felt stronger than ever before. The next morning, Ethan requested meetings with several industry contacts. Most declined. A few listened politely before dismissing his ideas. Others barely hid their skepticism. You are chasing ghosts, one former executive told him. The market already decided that property has no future. Ethan thanked him and ended the call. Yet the criticism no longer discouraged him the way it once had. In fact, it reminded him of something. The market often followed consensus. Opportunity rarely did. Meanwhile, inside Sterling Logistics headquarters, Victoria Sterling reviewed strategic reports with her leadership team. The discussion focused on expansion opportunities, regional transportation capacity, and future infrastructure investments. Several executives spoke confidently. Charts filled large screens. Forecasts projected growth. Then one analyst mentioned a developing transportation initiative receiving increased government attention. The room briefly paused. Victoria listened carefully before moving to the next agenda item. It seemed like a small detail. Nothing urgent. Nothing dramatic. Yet somewhere deep in the back of her mind, she made a note to watch it. Across the city, Ethan stood alone on the roof of the largest warehouse as sunset painted the horizon in shades of gold and amber. Wind moved gently across the empty property below. The rail lines stretched into the distance. Highways carried endless streams of traffic beyond the industrial district, but clearly enough to know that something was coming. And if he was right, the world was about to look at this forgotten place very differently. The first sign was so small that almost nobody noticed it. A brief industry bulletin appeared on a transportation website late on a Friday afternoon. Most executives had already left for the weekend. Most analysts ignored it completely, but Ethan saw it before sunrise the next morning. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he read the announcement 3 times. Then a fourth, then a fifth. His eyes moved carefully across every line. The language was cautious, technical, easy to overlook. Yet beneath the bureaucratic wording, something important had changed. One of the infrastructure initiatives he had been tracking for months was moving forward faster than expected. Not completed, not guaranteed, but moving. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared through the window as dawn painted the city in pale shades of blue and silver. His heart beat a little faster. For over a year, he had been studying possibilities that everyone else dismissed. For over a year, he had been carrying risk that nobody understood. And now, for the first time, reality seemed to be inching toward the future he had imagined. Later that day, he drove to the property. The morning air carried the scent of wet pavement and fresh spring rain. As he stepped out of his truck, the massive warehouses stood before him exactly as they always had. Rusted, weathered, silent. Yet they no longer looked abandoned. At least not to him. He walked slowly across the grounds. The same loading docks, the same rail connections, the same access roads everyone else ignored. Only now he could almost feel the invisible currents beginning to shift around them. Not enough to celebrate, not enough to relax, just enough to believe he was not crazy. Meanwhile, the financial pressure remained relentless. Loan payments arrived every month without fail. Insurance costs continued climbing. Repairs seemed endless. More than once, Ethan found himself choosing between improvements he wanted and expenses he could actually afford. Every dollar mattered. Every decision carried consequences. One evening, while reviewing budgets inside the warehouse office, his phone rang. The caller was Greg Mercer. Ethan answered immediately. "How are things?" Greg asked. Ethan smiled. "Complicated." Greg laughed softly. "I figured." A brief silence followed. Then Greg spoke more carefully. "I heard something interesting today." Ethan sat up slightly. "What kind of interesting?" "Several logistics firms are quietly reviewing industrial properties near the transportation corridor." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "Are they serious?" "Serious enough to send teams." Ethan stared across the office. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight. Outside, the property remained quiet, but not as quiet as before. "Why?" he asked. Greg hesitated. "Nobody seems completely sure yet." After the call ended, Ethan sat motionless for several minutes. The information itself was not proof. It did not guarantee success, yet it confirmed something important. Other people were beginning to look in the same direction. Across the city, Victoria Sterling was facing a different kind of pressure. During a strategic planning meeting, several board members raised concerns about future capacity demands. Regional transportation bottlenecks, distribution efficiency, long-term infrastructure access. Questions that once seemed distant now demanded attention. Victoria listened carefully. Her confidence remained intact, but she disliked uncertainty. She always had. One executive referenced a cluster of industrial properties receiving renewed attention from investors. Victoria made a note. Then another. The conversation moved on. Yet the subject lingered longer than she expected. Days turned into weeks. More reports appeared. More discussions surfaced. Industry publications began mentioning transportation realignment scenarios. Analysts debated future distribution needs. Investors started asking questions. Most people still viewed the changes as theoretical. Ethan did not. He spent every spare hour preparing, organizing records, improving sections of the property, updating plans, reviewing contracts. Not because success was guaranteed, because if opportunity arrived, he intended to be ready. Then one afternoon, something happened that made him stop in the middle of a warehouse aisle. A black SUV rolled slowly through the front gate. Then another. Then a third. Visitors. Professional visitors. Men and women carrying clipboards and cameras stepped onto the property. They studied the rail lines. They photographed loading areas. They examined access routes. Ethan watched quietly from a distance. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody recognized the man standing in worn work clothes near the warehouse entrance. Yet for the first time, people who once would have driven past without slowing down were walking the same ground he had believed in when no one else would. And as the sun lowered behind the warehouses, casting long golden shadows across the property, Ethan realized the silence surrounding this forgotten place was beginning to break. The weeks that followed felt different. Not easier, not safer, just different. The property that had once sat unnoticed behind rusted gates was no longer invisible. More vehicles arrived. More visitors walked the grounds. Consultants carried tablets. Investors studied maps. Executives asked questions. The same warehouses people once called worthless were suddenly appearing in conversations throughout the industry. Ethan noticed every change. Yet he remained cautious. He had spent too long living with uncertainty to mistake interest for victory. One morning he arrived at the property before sunrise as usual. A thick fog hung over the rail lines. The warehouses emerged from the mist like enormous shadows stretching across the horizon. As he unlocked the office door, he noticed a business card tucked beneath it. No note. No explanation. Just a name. A major investment group. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. Then he slipped it into his pocket and continued working. By midday his phone began ringing. The first caller wanted information. The second requested a meeting. The third asked whether he would consider selling. Ethan answered politely, carefully, respectfully. Yet every conversation ended the same way. He was not interested in selling. Not yet. That answer surprised people. Some sounded confused. Others sounded amused. A few sounded frustrated. They saw an abandoned industrial property. Ethan saw something they still did not fully understand. Meanwhile, inside Sterling Logistics headquarters, the atmosphere had begun to shift. Reports arrived faster than before. Market forecasts required constant revisions. Strategic planning meetings grew longer. More questions appeared than answers. During one executive briefing, Victoria listened as a transportation analyst explained emerging infrastructure developments. The analyst highlighted several industrial assets receiving unexpected attention. Then a photograph appeared on the presentation screen. A photograph of Ethan's property. The room fell briefly quiet. Victoria stared at the image. Something about it felt familiar. Not the property itself. The timing. The circumstances. The feeling that she had overlooked something important. Who owns it, she asked. The analyst checked his notes. A private investor. Name. The analyst glanced down again, then looked back up. Ethan Walker. For a moment nobody spoke. Victoria's expression remained composed. Professional. Controlled. Yet several executives noticed the subtle change in her eyes. The room moved on to the next topic. Victoria's thoughts did not. Later that evening she stood alone inside her office overlooking the city skyline. Lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass. The same skyline she had conquered through discipline and ambition. The same skyline beneath which she had once told a man his career was over. Ethan Walker. The name lingered in her mind. Not because she regretted firing him. At least that was what she told herself. But because she disliked surprises. And somehow, despite all her planning, Ethan had become one. Across the city, Ethan faced pressures of his own. Interest in the property continued growing. Yet growing attention brought growing complications. Lawyers called. Investors called. Financial institutions suddenly wanted meetings. Companies that had ignored him for months now treated him very differently. Sophie noticed the change before he did. One evening, she sat across from him during dinner while his phone vibrated for the fourth time in 10 minutes. "You are popular now," she said. Ethan laughed softly. "I would not go that far. People keep calling. People usually want something." Sophie considered that. Then she asked the question Ethan had been avoiding himself. "Are you going to sell it?" The room became quiet. Outside, summer sunlight faded behind apartment buildings. Traffic hummed softly below. Ethan looked at his daughter for a long moment. "I do not know." Sophie nodded. "I think you do." Ethan smiled faintly. Children had a remarkable talent for finding truth hidden beneath uncertainty. Days later, an invitation arrived. Private meeting. High-level executives. Significant proposal. Ethan read the letter twice before setting it aside. He already knew what they wanted. The question was whether they understood what they were asking for. The following afternoon, he stood once again on the roof of the largest warehouse. Warm summer wind moved across the property. Below him, workers, inspectors, and visitors crossed ground that had once been completely abandoned. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Activity had returned. Energy had returned. Possibility had returned. Ethan looked toward the distant skyline where glass towers shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere among those towers sat people who once believed he was finished. Somewhere among them sat Victoria Sterling. And for the first time since that day in the conference room, their paths were beginning to move toward each other again. Not through anger, not through revenge, through something far more powerful. The simple reality that time has a way of revealing what people fail to see when pride is louder than wisdom. The meeting took place on the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the Chicago skyline. 3 years earlier, Ethan Walker had walked out of a building like this carrying a cardboard box and a reputation people said would never recover. Now he stepped into a conference room filled with executives, investors, attorneys, and industry leaders. The difference was not the room. The difference was the man. Ethan wore the same quiet confidence he had carried through every setback, every sleepless night, every uncertain decision. Around the table sat representatives from some of the largest logistics companies in the country. They had all come for the same reason. They wanted what he owned. One by one, proposals were presented. Partnerships, acquisitions, buyouts. Numbers so large they would have sounded impossible only a few years earlier. Ethan listened respectfully, asked thoughtful questions, took careful notes. Then he made a decision that surprised nearly everyone in the room. He would not sell the future he had spent years building. Instead, he would create something new, something independent, something lasting. Months later, construction crews filled the property that had once been dismissed as worthless. The old warehouses were restored. Rail access was expanded. New facilities rose from ground that people had ignored for years. Trucks arrived. Employees arrived. Opportunity arrived. What had once been silence became movement. What had once been abandonment became purpose. And at the center of it all stood a company founded by a single father who had simply refused to quit. The growth came steadily after that. Not overnight. Not through luck. Through patience. Through vision. Through thousands of small decisions made when nobody was watching. Ethan hired people others overlooked. Veterans. Single parents. Workers rebuilding their lives after difficult seasons. He remembered what it felt like to be dismissed. He never forgot. 5 years after purchasing the property, Ethan Walker stood on a stage at the National Logistics Leadership Summit. More than 2,000 people filled the ballroom. Industry leaders from across the country had gathered to celebrate innovation and long-term impact. Large screens displayed images of the transformed industrial campus. The same property that experts once called a mistake. The same property that had nearly cost him everything. Applause filled the room as Ethan accepted an award recognizing one of the most successful logistics expansions in the nation. Yet he did not immediately step to the microphone. Instead, he looked toward the front row. Sophie sat there, now older, taller, more confident. The little girl who had done homework beneath warehouse lights. The little girl who had believed in him when nobody else did. Ethan smiled and motioned for her to join him on stage. The audience watched as Sophie walked to the podium. She looked out across the crowd for a moment before speaking. Her voice was calm, steady. People think my dad bought a warehouse. A gentle laugh moved through the room. Sophie shook her head softly. He did not. The room grew quiet. He bought a future. He bought a chance when nobody else could see one. And when everyone told him to walk away, he stayed. Silence settled across the ballroom. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind that arrives when truth enters a room. In the audience, Victoria Sterling sat perfectly still. Time had changed many things. Success had continued. Businesses had grown. Markets had evolved. Yet as she watched Sophie standing beside her father, she understood something she had missed years ago. Ethan's greatest strength had never been strategy. It had never been timing. It had never been business. It was character. When the applause finally came, it rose slowly. Then louder still. Soon the entire ballroom stood. Thousands of people on their feet. Not celebrating wealth. Not celebrating victory. Celebrating perseverance. Ethan looked across the crowd. Then toward Sophie. Then toward the distant memory of every difficult day that had brought them there. He had never needed revenge. Life had already provided something better. Understanding. Respect. Redemption. Later that evening, long after the ceremony ended, Ethan and Sophie stood outside beneath a sky filled with city lights. The wind moved gently through the streets. Traffic hummed in the distance. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Sophie smiled. Remember when everyone thought that place was worthless? Ethan laughed softly. I remember. She slipped her arm through his. Good thing you did not listen. Ethan looked toward the skyline. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones nobody else believes in yet. And standing there beside the daughter who had walked every mile of the journey with him, he realized success had never been the buildings, the contracts, or the awards. Success was keeping a promise when quitting would have been easier. Success was choosing dignity when bitterness would have been understandable. Success was building something good without becoming hard along the way. If this story reminded you that setbacks are not the end, that character matters more than circumstances, And that second chances often arrive disguised as obstacles. Share your thoughts below. And if stories about quiet strength, redemption, and hope still have a place in this world, we would be honored to have you here for the next journey.